Welcome, Elena. Hello, dear Stan. Good to see you.
Dan.
Mhm.
We'll give this just another minute for people to find their way over and for this train to go by here in downtown Rapid City, and we'll get going. All right, I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Peter Strong, co-owner and director of Racing Magpie. On behalf of our whole team, I want to welcome everyone to another exciting presentation that's part of our new program called Winter Camp. Today we're here with Deborah Bordeaux and Christopher G. Bordeaux, who are presenting their talk. Hold on one second. Too many things going on. Who are presenting their talk titled Indian Education, Such as It Is. This is the second of a two-part workshop looking at art and creativity in Lakota education. Here at Racing Magpie, we're dedicated to elevating and amplifying Native and other artists and their communities through educational, cultural, and research programs, all in the Lakota spirit of being a good relative. As part of that being a good relative, this program is reimagining the Lakota Winter Camp model of problem solving and community building in today's world by examining the deeper reasons why Lakota people do things the way they do and why they interact with the universe around them the way they do. These events are free and open to the public, and we're targeting Lakota community members as both presenters and attendees. As plants and trees focus their energy on building strength and growing from the roots during the winter, our community will join to strengthen and grow together each year through sharing and learning. We want to thank our sponsors for their generous support to make sure this event could happen. The South Dakota Humanities Council, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for Humanities, the Bush Foundation, and the National Endowment for the Humanities with a direct grant. And finally, we've been asked several times how our supporters can contribute to our work as well. I could quickly suggest like 3 ways in these times of virtual working and community care that to do so. One is you can make a donation to Magpie Creative, which is our nonprofit partner in our work, through their Facebook page or mailing in a donation. You could buy raffle tickets. Right now, we're holding an exciting raffle where the winners receive a piece of original artwork. $5 a ticket, 5 for $20. Purchase those at racingmagpie.com. The drawing is next Friday the 18th. Or support Native artists and makers and creatives by searching them out and buying their art, buying presents, buying self-care presents directly from those artists. So we'd encourage you to do that and to support us in one of those 3 ways. Without any further delay, I want to introduce Golnesa Ashegali, part of our Racing Magpie team, to do some housekeeping and to introduce our speakers. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome, everyone. It's so good to see you and be with you all. I'm Golnesa. I use they, she pronouns, and I'm an Iranian here in occupied Oceti Sakowin territory. As a former classroom teacher and an educator, I'm particularly excited for this month's events. Last week was amazing, of course, and I'm so eager for part 2 today. Please join us for the youth panel on education this Tuesday. That's going to be really exciting as well. As always, please take care of yourself in all the ways that you need, with your camera on or off, meeting your body's needs for food and drink. Questions today are going to be answered at the end of the presentation. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat as they come up so you don't lose them, or hold them all the way until the end, but they'll be taken at the end either way. Mrs. Deborah Bordeaux is currently the Executive Director for the Commission for Oceti Sakowin Accreditation, the only tribally approved accrediting agency. Deborah works to develop and promote Native education with a focus on Native language and culture to be included and the primary curriculum for Native children. Deborah is a graduate of Oglala Lakota College with a Bachelor of Science Degree and received her Master's Degree in Education Leadership from South Dakota State University and Sinte Gleska University. Previous to her bachelor's degree, she had a nursing degree as an LPN from the United Tribes Educational Center. Deborah has worked in the capacity of a teacher aide, special education teacher, and elementary principal. Deborah has 35 plus years experience working in tribal controlled grant schools. During this time, Deborah worked with a local parent group to get a federal law passed for tribal education departments, has developed and delivered testimony to congressional leaders and staff on Indian education, developed and implemented budgets, policies and procedures, and developed relationship with educators. She helped develop and implemented a tribal accrediting process with all appropriate approvals and acceptance. Deborah is married for 47 years, has 4 children and 4 grandchildren. Deb and Chris have their master's degrees and all 4 children have their bachelor's degrees. 2 have their master's degree and are currently working on their PhDs. 1 grandchild has a bachelor degree, becoming the 4th generation in Deborah's lineage to have a college degree. Deborah's great-grandfather Pute always encouraged education. Christopher G. Bordeaux, married to Deborah, lives in Slim Butte's Loafer Camp community on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. He is an enrolled member of the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Chris is the executive director of the Oceti Sakowin Education Consortium. A retired gifted and talented educator and principal, Chris has an MS in ED admin from Oglala Lakota College, a BS in elementary education from Black Hills State College, and an endorsement in gifted education from the University of South Dakota. The majority of his teaching career was in gifted education in tribal schools. Chris has served 8 terms on the South Dakota Indian Education Association Board and 3 terms on the National Indian Education Association Board, currently a member of the South Dakota Parent Connection Board, the Pine Ridge Girls School Board, and he is a consultant for tribal schools. Handing it over now to the education power couple, the dream team, Mrs. and Mr. Bordeaux.
I suppose. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen for a PowerPoint. So one of the things that we want to help in helping people to understand about education is the focus is about learning. So I titled this, "What is learning all about?" and Indian education such as it is. So one time, Tom Casey was interviewing my mom and asking her about the Pine Ridge Reservation, and her response to him was, "This is home, such as it is." And we have this tendency to view living on the reservation as something negative, as something that we need to get away from, as something that is not good for us. In all reality, this is what we all cling to and return to and strive to stay here and make life better for all. So, and I think that was behind what she was saying in terms of such as it is. And so has Indian education has been developed over the years. I think that we realize and see the value and the importance of it. However, we as Native people need to be able to look at it and view it in a manner that is to our benefit. So in this process of learning or education, I hope to address what it is we need to know about education, what it is we need to know about learning, and can it change, and what to do to make it change. Uh, those are questions that I've surmised out of what people have discussed over the years. And we're always looking for answers as to how to improve what's happening for our children in a classroom. And part of it is we need to understand where Indian education has come from and what has been imposed on us over the years. So what do we need to know about education? Prior to contact with the Western civilization, as Native people, we educated we educated ourselves on the basis of the needs of people, to be relatives to all. We all includes people, animals, the four-legged, the two-legged, the winged, plants, and the spirits, to maintain the people. So education, as it is for who we are as Native people, wasn't about learning, wasn't about knowing about math and reading and science and social studies. It was about how we interact with all of our relatives. I want to read you a quote that I think is important. Societies that have dominated world's smaller cultures and the world's natural resources for the past 200 years have come to, have come to believe: one, man can control the ways of the natural world, and two, man can continue to exploit certain natural resources indefinitely, and three, all mysteries and all certainties, the unknown, can ultimately be conquered. And that comes from a book that I started reading way back in my early years. It's called The Sacred, and I have it in the bibliography at the end. But this was written back in the 70s, and the authors visited with a lot of Native people to come up with this definition about what happens with Native people. So I just encourage you to keep that in your mind as we move forward and think about how does this impact our people. So contact with Western civilization changed how our Native people viewed education. When treaties were established, they stated to ensure civilization, the elementary branches of English education must be taught. This established what would be taught to civilize the natives. The focus was to educate the natives like people of Western civilization, to be civilized. So again, when you think about what it is that was intended for us when the Europeans first came to this continent, their desire was to be in control and to make everybody else, remake everybody that lived on this continent in their image. So again, another quote that I wanted to be able to share with you is about learning. Is learning, and this comes from the same book, The Sacred. Learning should be unsettling, hard, funny, and different for different people. Over the years, sacred ways, metaphysics, and non-ordinary ways of learning have disappeared from daily life and education systems and the education systems of the Western civilization. Basic education among natives did not separate the search for knowledge from sacred learning. Native sacred ways insist on learning education as an essential. So Native people looked at education and realized the value of it and what was important, and it's something that they provided on a daily basis for their youth, their young people, so that they would be able to, as I stated earlier, to maintain the people and how they existed. So it's really important how education is viewed. So what is it that we need to know about learning? Learning prior to contact with Western civilization was based on relationships, spirituality, and interactions. And going back to that statement that I read earlier, just a few minutes ago about learning, we never separated things out. As Native people, we kept everything, we made everything one thing. I don't know, I'm trying to figure out how to say that, but everything that happened in our daily lives was done in such a way that we didn't separate them out and do silos. And I don't know how many of you were part of last week's presentation, but we shared a presentation by a gentleman by the name of Ken Robbins, who talked about how education is driven today and everything is put in separately. So when Native people are doing these things, we didn't separate those things out. So learning after contact with civilization was and is based on forcing natives to be like the civilized man. So one of the first people to talk about education was Ben Franklin. And he had again, this comes out of the sacred, he made a statement and he offered education to Native youth on the East Coast. And this is a response of one of the leaders to Ben Franklin. He said, "But you who are wise must know that different nations have different concepts of things, and you will therefore not take it amiss if our ideas of this kind of education happen not to be the same with yours. We have had some experience of it. Several of our young people formerly brought up at the colleges of the northern provinces. They were instructed in all your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear the cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, were therefore neither fit for hunter, warrior, nor counselor. They were totally good for nothing. We, however, know the less obligation by the kind offer, though we decline accepting it, and to show our grateful sense of it, if gentlemen of Virginia will send us a dozen of their sons, we will take great care of their education and instruct them in all we know and make them men." So just reinforcing that view of education for how Native people viewed things versus how Western civilization viewed things. So Captain Richard Henry Pratt was the first man to formalize education for Native people here in the United States. And he did a trial run with natives that were imprisoned in Florida and felt he was successful. And so then he's created the boarding school in Pennsylvania called Carlisle, and Native children were gathered up and brought there. And the intent of what they were doing was to kill the Indian and save the man. And this is the idea behind Indian education. And it is something that we as Native people, when we educate ourselves and each other, we have to think about that. Is it necessary to kill the Indian to save the man? And we have to be able to determine for ourselves how to be able to get away from that perspective. From what Henry Pratt did, boarding schools were started, and there were 4 key goals when boarding schools were started, specifically the ones that were there to focus on Christian education. There was a strong desire to teach English to Native people because they couldn't understand them. And the only way to understand the Indian was to make them learn English. So the Native people were not allowed to speak their own language. Then the next thing was there was a desire to Christianize them because they were viewed as heathens and savages because they did not practice the Christian way of life and how it was determined by Western civilization. And this word inculcate was part of where I took my quote from. Their desire, that was to make us like them. And so they were putting in us their values, their beliefs of possessive individualism, and ultimately preparing us for American citizenship. So in that statement there, the desire was they knew that by working together as a people, being Native people, that there was strength in that. So the desire of saving the man was to kill that Indian part of us and take that out of us. So that's one of the things that we've learned in education is that individualism, and that that we will know how to be an American citizen. And that's what America is all about, is that individualism and being separate from everybody else. And we know that that doesn't work. So we have to figure out how do we do things differently. And again, coming back to the presentation that we did last week, where it talked about how students are discouraged from working with each other. They're discouraged from sharing information because by doing that, then you're going against that possessive individualism. Then in 1923, Commissioner John Collier declared the administration for, excuse me, for Indians was to, have to find my notes. John Collier declared the administration of Indian Affairs a disgrace. This Bureau of Indian Affairs that was established was a system to rob Indians of their property, destroy their culture, and eventually exterminate them. So from the beginning, clear back to when the Europeans first came to this continent, their desire was to eliminate or get rid of Indian people because they were in the way of what their progress and what they're choosing to do. So that's what education is all about, is to eliminate and to exterminate Native people. And so we really have to think about that. Is that what we want in terms of education for our people? Do we want to be fashioning our process of learning for our children to move towards killing the Indian and saving the man? And those, when we talk about being a sovereign nation and establishing education for our youth, our young people, we need to make that determination. So that comes to this question of, can it change? Can we change the education system to work for our children? So the other question is, what is best for Native children? So over the years since Henry Pratt put Carlisle in place, there have been numerous reports about Indian education and what's happening to Indian people. In 1928, there was a Merriam report that condemned boarding schools. In 1969, there was the Kennedy report, Indian education, a national tragedy, a national challenge. In 1991, there was a report called Indian Nations at Risk. In 92, there was a White House conference on Indian education that came up with recommendations for the United States. And then the Bureau of Indian Education developed a restructuring document in the early 2000s. Whoop, I skipped over the Indian Education Study of 2014. And then also in 2014 is the Native Youth Report from the White House. President Obama had instructed that there be a report about Native youth. So the summary of all of these reports pretty much say the same thing. They tell this is what should be happening in education. They say that instruction should support Native culture and language. Strengthen the family and societal or social structure. Support local control. And a local educator's interpretation of these was, these reports say our children need to be loved, need teachers who care about them, and a community to transition them to school and back home again. So what these reports have all said over this period of time is we need to pay attention to the children and what their needs are and interact with them. And it's a hard concept for people to understand. So what do we need to do to make this change? Right now, the new buzzword is decolonize. And so what does that mean, to decolonize? We need to think about that. You know, is decolonization not having holidays? Is decolonization changing how we wear our clothes? Is decolonization about how we interact or how we run our schools? I know that almost all the schools on our reservation here in Pine Ridge, you could probably take those, each classroom, if you could take it and put it in a classroom or a school structure in, say, Rapid City or Pierre or Sioux Falls, and put it in there, it would function the same way. All the children come in, they sit in rows, the teacher stands up at the front of the classroom and does instruction. And that we keep doing that over and over. That hasn't worked, obviously, because now we have the lowest test scores. We have our attendance rates are low, our graduation rates are low, we have high suicide in our communities. So what is decolonization? What does that mean? We really need to take a look at that. So one of the things I think is that we need to build relationships, view children as children. Chris and I were having a conversation about this the other day. He had gone into the store, Bats, to purchase something, and while he was there, there was a young child, probably 8 to 10 years old, that came in with the EBT card and knew how to purchase food with the EBT card and everything that needed to be done. And Chris was saying that the clerk responded to that 10-year-old the same way they respond to an adult. And so I don't know how to think about that, and having that happens regularly. And I thought about all the things that I encountered when I was being the principal at a school, and I have a real worry about our children. And certainly our children need to learn how to interact in this world, but um, how do we help them learn how to be children? So we need to be able to take that time to help them and guide them through that process. That's one of the things that I think school is about. The other next statement I have here is no need to civilize anymore. Everything that our schools are designed to do is to civilize us. Do you, as a Native person, see yourself as being civilized? Do you still need to be civilized? And I just think it's really important to think about that. The even, you know, again, coming back to the presentation we did last week about using that the document or the little video on the education system, to think about the whole education system was designed to have people be prepared for the industrial age. And I think we're really well past that industrial age now, and need to think more about what are we doing as a result of technology. Oftentimes our children are on information overload, but I don't think in that, if we are defining how we need to be civilized is part of that. But we do need to be civil towards one another, and we need to know how to interact in a diverse community. And how do we help our people do that? So another concept that I think is important is that we need to focus on the needs of our people. And when I think about that, the one thing that keeps coming to my mind of trying to figure out how to give an example of how we need to look at what we're doing for our children. One time when I was first started working at Lone Man, one of the school board members there had, when Lone Man first became a tribal contract school and then a tribal grant school, their desire was to make sure that language and culture was part of what they did at the school. And so this particular school board member wondered and presented to the board, is this something that we could do, where we just do teaching English and reading and math in the morning, and then in the afternoon after lunch, we start teaching about language and culture. And so that's the school day. Is the morning is the English part and the afternoon is the Lakota part. But it was at a time when South Dakota's rules for instruction required a certain amount of minutes for each subject. So they didn't see how they could make that work. But the example that came to my mind, because our people often taught like this with their children, was Harry Potter. And Harry Potter went to a regular school up until he was 10 years old. And then when he was 10 years old, he was sent to a school of magic to teach him how to be magic like the rest of his people, who were all magic people. They were all knew how to, that had magic in them and knew how to manage it and knew how to use it, knew how to work with it. So we think about that for our children. What can we do to help them? Help them so that when they become adults, they can turn around and do the same for their children. So as we move to the next statement of following the results of the reports, all those reports that I had talked about earlier and shared earlier, the Merriam report, the Kennedy report, the Nations at Risk report, they all say, if you do this, that will help these children. But yet we have not, as a education community, have not taken the time to put all of those in place to see how that works for our people to be, however we define successful. So we need to figure out how we would use language and culture regularly and on a daily basis in that classroom with the students. Support our families and the social structure. How do we make that part of what we do at the school? And support local control. It's really hard because as Native people, we learned how to speak up and demand, but then what once we get there? So we need to learn how to have community support and help one another, and then recognize tribal sovereignty. And that's a real difficult concept because we don't know how to be sovereign people. We're very dependent upon Western society, Western civilization to function in all that we do. So how do we be able to blend this in a way that it's to our benefit, and move forward with that? I know that Chris told me slow down, but I have a hard time slowing down. So these are the books that I use quite a bit. The Sacred Ways of Knowledge Sources of Life by Peggy, I can't see her last name there, but Beck and Anna Walters. And it was a book I got when I first went to college back in the early 70s. And I think it's a valuable book. And there's a lot of information in there. And it really has a lot of emphasis on spirituality and how that's an important part of our lives. Not religion, but spirituality. And then I always encourage Water Lily and Speaking of Indians by Ella Deloria. She, lived at a time when we were transitioning from living on the prairie to living on reservations. And she wanted to be able to put our way of life down in writing so that it could be maintained for people in the future. And so and her manuscripts have more information than what's in these two books, Water Lily and Speaking of Indians, but there's a lot of information there that can help guide us and to understand how our people interacted with each other. And there's a quote I wanted to share of hers that she has in the forward of her book, but she also of Water Lily, and then she has it in a chapter about kinship in Speaking of Indians. And Ella Deloria said that the ultimate aim of Dakota life, stripped of accessories, was quite simple. One must obey kinship rules. One must be a good relative. No Dakota who has participated in that life will dispute that. In the last analysis, every other consideration was secondary. Property, personal ambition, glory, good times, life itself. Without that aim and the constant struggle to attain it, the people would no longer be Dakota in truth. They would no longer even be human. To be a good Dakota then was to be humanized and civilized. And to be civilized was to keep the rules imposed by kinship for achieving civility, good manners, and a sense of responsibility towards every individual dealt with. Thus only was it possible to live communally with success, and that is to say, with a minimum of friction and a maximum of goodwill. And to me, that tells us how we need to use that as a guide about and helping us to design how we would provide education for our children and have schools that would help us to produce children that are good relatives and are able to help support what's going on our reservations. That being here on the reservation is a good thing, that life is good and life is important here. Some of the other quotes that I had in my PowerPoint, I took from another PowerPoint that I did for the Sinte Gleska University's Founders Week that they had, and this was a couple years ago. So just referencing my own PowerPoint. But I just really think that we have to evolve to a time or a place where we're being more supportive of each other, that we accept each other for what we can do and our education. It's really hard for us as Native people to acknowledge when Native people are providing the expertise. And so one of the goals that we had with our organization or agency that we developed, our commission for Oceti Sakowin Accreditation, was to encourage schools to take that opportunity to be more responsible about how they're structuring their schools. We no longer have to do the rigid 90 minutes of reading, 90 minutes of math, and we can take the opportunity to teach and give our students that opportunity, or to learn, help our students learn and give them the opportunity to use things from everyday life as part of their learning process. This will help them to become better citizens for themselves. The other thing that I wanted to be able to share was how we treat one another, which is really difficult for us as Native people because we've learned how to be individuals. We've learned to be selfish, and that's not how how our people were a long time ago. They were always there, very generous and helping each other out. So there is another quote that I wanted to be able to share from Ella Deloria, that this one specifically in her book about water lily. So in this one is called a kinship appeal. So for us as Native people, knowing who our relatives are really important. And so this was a gentleman that had come to visit the camp, and he liked to share stories. So he's telling this. His name is Yankton. So Yankton described how he once saw the kinship appeal used to settle a score. The enraged young relatives of a slain man debated the kind of punishment they ought to mete out to the slayer who was still at large. As they debated, their eldest relative, a man of great influence in the entire tribe, sat listening as though in accord with them. After they had all talked themselves out, he began to speak. With consummate skill, he gave them the impression that he was going along with them all the way. My kindred, cousins, brothers, sons, and nephews, all, today we have been made to weep without shame, men though we are. Someone has dared to do us an injury in slaying our young relative. Has he not thereby grossly insulted our family pride and our honor? Our kinsman was young. He too loved life. He was not ready to die, yet he is dead. Should we not vow that his slayer too shall die? Should we not go out forthwith and kill him? Very well, then, why do we sit here talking? Why not give the murderer his due at once? He smoked quietly after this, calm and steady. In due time, he resumed speaking, but now he had changed his tact. And yet, he repeated it, and yet, my kindred, there is a better way. That the fire of hate may not burn in his heart or in ours, we shall take that better way. That the fire of hate may not burn, in our hearts, we shall take this better way. Go now to your homes, look over your possessions, and bring here the thing you most prize, a horse, say, or weapons, or wearing apparel or blankets. Easy ways and empty words may do for others. We are men of another make, so let us take the harder way, the better way. If but a few are able to do that, then let us be of the few. The gifts you bring shall go to the murderer for a token of our sincerity and our purpose. Though he has hurt us, we shall make him something to us, a relative, in place of the one who is not here. Was the dead your brother, then this man shall be your brother, or your uncle or your cousin. As for me, the dead was my nephew. Therefore, his slayer shall be my nephew, and from now on he shall be one of us. We shall regard him as though he were our dead kinsman returned to us. Yankton and his host smoked a while, then he said, "My friend, that was a tremendous proposal, would you not say?" Indeed, it was his host. It was, his host agreed. And what assurance of leadership that our elder kinsman must have to dare to suggest such a thing. For it required each man to undergo an inner battle with himself to master his pride and anger first. This is not easy. I take it they all do so. Yes, they accepted what their elder kinsman said because they saw it was right and they saw it was easy enough to fight violence with violence. Killing was a work of the moment, but to take the murderer as a relative after what he had done and to live in sincerity and create good will be with him day in and day out to the end of his life. That was something else. So that was a practice that we had as Native people, taking the harder way, because in the end it would be a better way. So we need to think about those things and try to take that step when it comes to education for or learning for our young people. What is to find that better way? What is it that we need to be able to do? Any questions that you might have, if you could put them in the chat box, and then I will certainly be willing to have a conversation. And Chris is on part of this too, and he's there to have conversation. I put our contact information here if anybody's interested in contacting us. We certainly can work with you.
Debbie, can you go back, your PowerPoint, go back towards the beginning? Right there. One ahead where it talks about, yeah, that one. You talked about, one thing you talked about in there was they taught us to control things. And I talked last week about that teachers, that's when we learned how to be teachers, that's what we talked about was classroom control. And that was that was almost that was a class. They call it management, but it was controlling the classes. And we were all taught to do that. And that isn't the way to teach. That isn't the way to help our children learn. And the where it said, I think you read it where it said, learning should be unsettling, is how you said it. And I worked with a lady from Germany. I don't know if any of you know her name is Uli Free. And we worked at in Gifted and Talented at Wounded Knee District School for quite a few years. And at the end of the day, we would always sit and just talk about things and talk about the day and talk about students. And there were always had TV on, and I'd watch documentaries because I like documentaries. And this one time they were showing a lot of documentaries about Nazis. And she walked in one time and she saw what I was watching and she said, "Are you watching about those goddamn Nazis again?" And so we both laughed. And she said her dad was a Hitler youth. and fought during the World War II. And after the war, he was in the Battle of the Bulge. And whenever they had time, they would drive over to where the Battle of the Bulge was, and he would look for Allied soldiers that were there, and he would meet with them, the ones that they fought against each other. And he said, she said he would always introduce himself, and they would talk about that. And he said they would always end up crying and hugging each other. And so then, we talked about, you were talking about education being unsettling. And she was really tough on students, not in a controlling way, but, and she said when she went to school, you were talking about that gentleman saying we should do all the math and stuff in the morning and then do culture and stuff in the afternoon. She said that was my whole, everything I did in all the way through high school, all the way through grade school, is in the morning we learned all the academic skills. In the afternoon we would do all of the practical things. And she said by 8th grade we were on a track to become something. And in high school, the goal for all high school students was to run their teachers out of the classroom, to run them out of the school if they weren't getting a good education. And it was, they were congratulated when they did that because of Nazism, because of what their children, what they had gone through under Hitler's rule, was they were controlled to believe he was right and he was a leader. They were controlled to do that. So when a teacher couldn't challenge the students enough, the students were encouraged to run that teacher out of the school. And I said last week, and I always say that is this classroom belongs to those children, not to those teachers. And once you get that in your head and you understand what that's about, I think that's when, to me, you become civilized. Is what is important, what benefits these children. And all of the laws that the United States made for Indian people was to benefit them, but they break those laws all the time. I mean, they made laws to benefit us, and all of those, the Miriam report, they all say the same thing, and there's laws to back them up, but people don't follow them. I mean, just like the Civil Rights Act, and they know what's good, they know what's going to help Indigenous people of color, but they don't follow them, and they don't try to follow them. And I like that word, possessive individualism, because they taught us how to be individuals, and they taught us how to own land. We never did. We never were individuals except to help people. We never were landowners. We took care of the land. And we were made to be those things. And we learned, we're really intelligent people. We learned all that stuff really good. So I just wanted to add that. There were some other things. Go ahead once in your PowerPoint. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. All those reports say the same thing. It's what that local educator said. And they're, back in 1928, they condemned boarding schools, and, boarding schools are still open, but they're doing okay because they changed how they're doing. But the actual boarding schools back then hadn't changed until what, the 70s, 80s? You know, they still had those kind of boarding schools. And they do all of this stuff. And it's like you said, we're still looking at what's important to them, not what's important to our children. Okay, go ahead. Okay. And I've been reading that book, Crazy Horse Weeps by Joseph Marshall. And I would recommend, you know, these books, what you have here, especially Water Lily and speaking of Indians, but I'd also recommend that Crazy Horse Weeps, because Joseph Marshall talks about all of this stuff again in there. And from I guess you could say, what Ella Deloria did in her day about how she saw it, Joseph Marshall does now and how he views it. And he says, this is my opinion. And, you know, he doesn't say you have to do this. And a lot of times when people read those things, read a lot of things, I guess, especially non-Indians, when they read things, they take it as you have to believe that's the only way. And he says it's not the only way. And it's what that person said, and the quote you said is, we all have different way of doing things, you know, and we're all different, but our ultimate aim is, like Ella Deloria said, be a good relative. And I would recommend reading that Crazy Horse Weeps by Joseph Marshall. I had some other stuff, but you know, I'm old, so I forget things.
So I have to write things down.
Write things down. I have a whole bunch of notes here, and when I look back on them, I was thinking, why did I write that? Didn't you attend the White House conference?
I did. Okay.
There are some questions or comments in the chat. Thank you for that comment, Madeline, in the beginning. And somebody on Facebook, how can we make effective relationships with non-Native educators to understand our Native children and families when it comes to our historical trauma and learned behaviors? To elaborate, meaning non-Native educators always have a one-size-fits-all approach, meaning MAPS testing and other testing modules, which primarily underserve Indian education. How would you address that, Debbie?
I was just recently asked that question. There's a lady that works for the Democratic Party here in South Dakota was asking, how do we help people understand about Native education? Well, it was more general, but for specifically here in South Dakota, they developed what they call the Oceti Sakowin Essential Understandings. And those were developed to help non-Native educators learn about Native people here in South Dakota, and then be able to teach that to their students in their classrooms. So that concept that was established was never followed. So I think that just like with the reports that were never followed, this idea that was put in place several years ago by educators in South Dakota is something that needs to happen. It's just learning about each other and then having some understanding of that. Um, you know, Native people are not real rigid about themselves. And I think it's important to take the time to learn and understand. Right now, again, the focus is, which gets out there, is all the negativity about us. And education right now is all about having high test scores and good attendance and high graduation rates, and I believe that our children can be there. It's just how we establish those expectations. So we have specific expectations for Native children, but we don't have any expectations of non-natives knowing about Native people. So it's just, we need to find a way to get information out to people so it's not all a focus on um, a negative perspective. And I think the Oceti Sakowin Essential Understandings is a place to start. It's a place to help people know. Um, it's taking the time to learn those things. I'm glad to see Mary and Minnie here. So I said, I want to see their faces so I can talk to them. It makes it easier for me. So that's what I think that is a place for here, specifically in South Dakota. Also, states like North Dakota, Montana, and Washington are putting similar things in place. Michigan also is a state that has those things in there. Standards about learning about the Native people in their state. So, Montana has a rule, Indian education for all. So it's mandated that all the schools in Montana learn about Native people. Washington has it at a certain grade level. Michigan has it, is working towards Indian education for all. So part of that could be influenced by how legislators approach things. So that would be one way to do that. I don't know if that's answering that question.
Yeah, another thing, if I can read this right. Happy Omani Mie asked that. And she also said, non-native educators always has a one size fits all map, meaning maps testing. And about testing, years ago, not a lot of years ago, maybe 6, 7 years ago, I asked a lot of young college graduates who had finished their master's degrees, were test scores and all of those standardized tests you took in high school, how did you do on them? And they just shrugged. They said, I don't remember. I said, were you proficient, advanced? And they shrugged again. And I said, were those inspirations for you to go on to college? And they said, no. I don't even hardly remember taking those tests. So for non-native educators, I think a thing they need to do is have those people, have those non-native educators find young people who are graduates, like our daughter Mary and our daughter Clementine. Were tests inspirational to you? I mean, I'm asking you that. Were tests inspirational to you? Test scores?
No. They said no.
Yeah. And then, and it says they underserve Indian education. And I don't know if it's they underserve Indian children, but that's what what Debbie was saying, Indian education is about, is our failures. Not our failures, but other people's view of how we are. One of my friends, who's now a school board member, said at one time, he said this, we've never been allowed to fail on our own terms, because failure is how you become successful. And so as long as we're kept failing our children, there's a lot of money involved that to keep education. I mean, education grants. Amy was asking about how can we leverage federal grant dollars to promote long-term and measurable academic for our children. I know one school, they made sure their children didn't succeed in all those testing so they could get more money. And in fact, those children are doing really well academically, but their focus is not on academics. It's on everything else and then academics just comes along. That's how, if you read Crazy Horse Weeps, Joseph Marshall talks about that. You learn how to do things in life. And in life, all of that is part of life. The math, the reading, all of that is part of life. The science. I mean, we were all scientists. We were all mathematicians. But we did that so the people would benefit, not so we could benefit. Gonna add any more to what Amy asked, Debbie?
In a minute, I wanted to share this as a post I saw on Facebook that I shared, and I think it's important. It's the fact that we keep buying the kids are falling behind academically narrative of this pandemic is the grossest example of how we allow corrupt versions of capitalism to alter our basic moral compass. Kids are only falling behind on a scale that adults are defining for them. A scale determined by test scores and achievement measures that were designed decades ago to sort kids by their potential future impact on the economy. This is a system designed to uplift the white and the wealthy, and when applied in a pandemic, it achieves its purpose with terrifying precision, filtering those with most resources straight to the top. Kids are only falling behind if they choose to measure them on scales that have been broken for decades. And we refuse to change them even during a pandemic in which thousands of their parents and grandparents, aunts and uncles are dying every day. Kids aren't falling behind, kids are adapting. They're learning new skills, they're overcoming. Kids are surviving a pandemic that's shaken their world before they fully understand it. Adults who say they care about them need to put away their measurement tools and show them some damn love and compassion. And that comes from a guy by the name of Leland Michael. But that's the bottom line, is that there are standards that are levels that have been established by someone long time ago that don't even know how life is functioning today. And we need to reestablish our expectations are, establish goals and rules that we want to be applicable to our children today. What is important? And love and understanding is an important part of that, and having compassion for those children. People are not bad. They learn it. The behavior that they have that is not liked is learned behavior. So we need to help everybody learn how to behave and know what that means when you're in a diverse environment and interact with each other. Test scores do not teach you how to behave. And they're just there to tell you if you know this about math or know this about reading or science or social studies. If we didn't break those barriers, we would never be able to go to the stars and the moon and verify everything we've said about that as Native people is true. or even verify that the creation stories that we have are true. If we limit ourselves, we're never going to go anyplace. So we need to change that. Change those parameters, establish new ones. And we need to say that it's applicable to everybody and not just certain people. And right now, the test scores have been established based on white, middle class, white society. And we need to change that. Native people need to acknowledge each other and recognize that Native people know how to do these things. We really limit ourselves. And there was a statement in a chat box about language. The lady, I think it's a lady that said, we need to be the ones teaching our language. And I agree. Our language generally is an oral language. We need to be able to teach that to each other and help each other. But we have also, because of this education, learned how to be dependent upon the written language. And so we need to be able to figure out how do we move forward with this. And unfortunately, there are a lot of non-Native people who have taken advantage of Native language. And it's not just Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, it's other languages too, where they wrote it down and said, this is the standard for this language. And we're the ones that are going to teach it. And we sit back and let that happen. We need to figure out how to step forward and say, hey, wait a minute. We know how to speak our language. We're the ones that need to be doing this, but we don't trust each other. You're not saying it right, so I don't want to listen to you. He's not saying it right, so I don't want to listen to him. Well, he comes from that community over there and they can't speak it right, so I don't want to listen to him. We do that to each other all the time. That's why I read that excerpt from Water Lily's book about kinship, the kinship appeal. We need to get past those hard things and be more open and supportive and helping each other rather than putting each other down and saying, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong. That's how we hear it all the time. That's what happens in education, in the classroom all the time. It's never, you're doing it right. It's always, you're doing it wrong. Or it's not, here, look, let's try it this way and do it this way. It's always about how you're doing it wrong. So we need to change our narrative for ourselves and how we approach things. And it's a conscious effort that we have to make. People have a hard time doing that. Now I got off on my soapbox. What was the other thing? There was another thing. Oh, the grants. Anytime.
How can you leverage federal grant dollars to promote long-term measurable academic achievement for our children?
By doing what you say you're going to do, and I just am so proud of Sage Fast Dog from Todd County Middle School. And it's not a federal grant that he had, it was a state grant. But he took that money and he put it in place and he used it the way it was intended to be used to help the children learn using their language and culture, and it had a really significant impact on that school. All the statistics were changed. Their test scores went up, their behavior went down, they liked each other, they supported one another, and it was a good thing. But the money ran out, so then they stopped doing it. So that's the hard part, is having that, once you put something in place, having it consistent and sustainable beyond the grant period. That's what's hard for all of us. We become so dependent upon grants or the competitive grants that we only do it as long as that grant is there. So when you put something in place, you have to make it sustainable and keep it going beyond the time of when the money is available for you, whatever organization that you're using. So if you write up a really good grant and they give you the money for it and you put it in place, then you have to make it embedded into what's happening in your school system and make it part of what's going on and make it functionable. That's what I can do.
And a lot of those grants say, they're going to close the achievement gap and you're going to do this, but it doesn't say how you're going to do it. And repeating something that doesn't work isn't the way to do it. It's involving those children and what the children want to know. And that, like what Debbie said, say what, do what you say you're going to do. The other one was Elena Singer said, how would you help non-native teachers utilize culture and language in their daily instruction? And I think it's not to try to teach the culture or teach the language, but find out what the children want, what the children know, and utilize their parents, their older relatives, and to bring them in, offer them $20 or something like that, or to feed them, and have them come in and just talk about that stuff, and not try to and it's like utilize a lot of the books, like I was talking about, like Debbie was saying, the Ella Deloria books, and Joseph Marshall, and read those to the children, have them read them, but don't interpret them for the children. And then the language stuff, I was this one part in Crazy Horse Weeps, what it made me laugh. I'll read it. He said, my father and I had a chuckle when we had the opportunity to talk about the movie Dances with Wolves. It is rife with historical and cultural inaccuracy, beginning with the title translated in Lakota, Shumani Tutanka O Boachi. The English title then should have been Dances with the Big Dog Who Lives Where the People Do Not. And that's it. Then he went into what it should say to say, Dances with Wolves. And there's, because the people who were trying to translate back ages ago, the non-Indians said, well, this is close enough. Let's say this means this. And so that's how they came up with that. And then he goes on to say, what if you had that up on the, Dances with the Big Dog Who Lives Where the People Do Not? He said, would they have won Oscars if you had that up, and I think what Lois said, she said, I don't agree with Caucasian teaching our sacred language. And I think you said it right there, Lois, our sacred language. Because our language is part of who we are. It's our nature. And it's everything that is in nature is in us. And that's always sacred. And we've learned how to use words to control. And our language never controlled us. We, everything you say in our language, every little word, I don't know if they're words, every little sound you made had meaning to our language. And it's just how you said them and how you put them together, because every word is a whole sentence, I guess, in itself. And to Elena, how non-native teachers could utilize this is to try to understand that for themselves, and not try to teach it, but try to understand that the culture and the language to themselves, and then not try to interpret anything for their students. But when you're done, if you read this, what Joseph Marshall says to third graders or even kindergarten, and ask them about it, they'll know what you're talking about. Because these little guys, when they come in, their intelligence level is way, way up there, way above all of us. And she said, we teach all the children, no matter the age, what we teach, who needs help, not by age or gender. And that was that video I showed. They said, why do we do that? Why do we teach children in batches? And the word, now is silos. Why do we teach them in silos? And we were never in silos. We were never in a box. There are no boxes. When they say out of the box, I say, what box do we get out of? Everything we learn, we get in a box if we learn it a certain way. Go ahead, Debbie, jump in there.
Well, I just wanted to share for Elena, there's a school here in South Dakota up on the northeast side that the parents had determined that they wanted culture and language to be part of what happened at their school. And it's been in existence probably about 25, 30 years now. And so everything that they did at that school was built off of including Dakota language and culture. And so it's really embedded in the school. So when you walk in the school, everything there is about being Dakota. And you could just feel it in the school. And because there was years ago when they were first structuring or putting that school together, that was their focus and their structure. They wanted children to feel good about coming to school and knowing who they are as a Dakota person. And so one of the things that the administration did was to take time to help all of their teachers learn how to use Dakota language. So a lot of what they focused on was terms that are used every day, greeting each other, how they say thank you, and use that every day in the classroom, used it every day in the school and in the classroom. And they gather every week and in the morning to pray and sing, and everybody's part of it. And it's just a quick prayer. Everybody comes together and they stand in the gym and they do this. And I know this because I went on an accreditation review at their school and observed in classrooms and both native and non-native teachers. And so the native teachers were, it was a natural thing for them. But when I went into the non-native classrooms, it was the same thing. The non-native teachers, it was a natural thing for them to reinforce using Dakota language and being able to share from that perspective. And the students responded in kind. So a lot of that needs to come from administrators, the school board and administrators of the school, being able to say to the staff, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. Another school in that same area, what they're doing is in a classroom, you can speak English as well as Dakota, but when you come out into the hall in the general areas where all of the students come together as a group, they speak Dakota. So anytime that anybody's in the hall, in the dining room, in the gym, in the offices, they all have to speak Dakota language. And all of the teachers, both native and non-native, have embraced this, and they take the time to learn how to do that. So those are some actions that you could take. We did that at Lone Man, where the language teachers taught everybody a greeting. So when the students came in from the school, came into the school from the buses, they were greeted in Lakota. The bus drivers greeted them in Lakota, and then they came into the school, and we assigned teachers to be, or teacher aides, adults to be at the door when the students come in, and they were all greeted in Lakota, and they went into the dining room to eat, then the cooks greeted them in Lakota. So it's just putting in efforts like those, making efforts like that to help the students learn. And the other thing is, like, for here in South Dakota, the Thai organization they have two people that have become quote and unquote experts on the Oceti Sakowin essential understandings, and they will work with teachers, all teachers, to teach them how to use those essential understandings in their classroom. South Dakota has embedded them in their social studies standards, so they're available for teachers to use. There's a website called Oglala Lakota project that has all those essential understandings there, and with stories and recordings of elders, songs that can be used. And North Dakota has something similar in place. I know that Michigan has books that they're using for their schools, and they have a online program where people can go online, teachers can go online to learn how to use their standards that they have for their natives in Michigan. I'm not sure what the state of Washington is doing and how Montana is approaching it, but Montana is the state that started the Indian education for all. So again, coming back to legislators are really important in this process and learning how to do that.
Well, Peter put up starting at Birdcage Books in Rapid City, and it's owned by Lily Mendoza, and she's also online. I was just in her the other day buying more water lily books, and she has probably, because she bought all of Davy Strain stuff, so she probably has the best what's the word?
Selection.
Best selection of native books, I would say, in the world. And but she's located on 7th and what's that corner?
St. Joe.
St. Joe, 7th and St. Joe. And she also has a website, wordcarrier.com. And thank you for all the responses on one of them said, you Pilamiae, you hit it spot on, Deb. And somebody else said, I truly believe this, Deb. Pilamia for sharing. We are in a different time, and readjusting to adapting involves change in the old standards set in place. And then somebody else said, yes, I love the understanding that test scores and academics come after diversified environments and relationships and building with families and community. And then Peter also put the website for Oglala Lakota. And Madeline said, my mom is Lily and she's listening. She says, thanks.
I buy a lot of books from Lily.
Yeah.
So, okay, anything else?
Debbie and I could get on one of our soapboxes if you want.
That's okay.
I was going back through some of these questions, see if we
miss anything?
missed anything.
I was in a meeting the other day, Peter, and this lady said, how do you get your little hand to do that? So I said, that's a pot holder stuck on the wall. So she said, I thought that was your little hand doing that. I said, I like Spock. So that was funny. Yeah. We need one of those little hands that goes like this. Live long and prosper.
Thank you so much.
Any other questions, comments?
Teachers know how to offer think time. So we wait, we sit here in silence.
Amen.
Thank you so much, dear Mrs. and Mr. Bordeaux. If folks would like to unmute and just say, see you later, express gratitudes as you see fitting, that would be really nice. And we can all leave from here. Tuesday's event is going to be great too. And I hope you'll all be there. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Pilamaya.
Doksha.
Thank you, Mom and Dad. Love you all.
Pilamia doksha ake.
Huh. Okay.